Welcome to today's MDIC Public Forum. We're really excited to have you join us today talking about the use of real-world evidence in the context of payer decision-making. Today's forum has three different parts. We're going to be talking about a landscape assessment of real-world evidence. Secondly, we're going to be talking about the repeal of MCIT and the promise of TCET. And then finally, we're going to have a panel discussion. So we look forward to your engagement and input and are excited to have you here. 18 months ago, MDIC commissioned a study of the landscape for the use of real-world evidence for medical devices and diagnostics. That included when and how real-world evidence is being used by payers, both CMS and private payers, to support their decision-making processes, including challenges to their use of real-world evidence and how CMS and commercial players may differ in their approach and integration of real-world evidence, and when and how real-world evidence is being used by organizations that influence payer decisions, such as health technology assessment organizations, HTAs, and clinical guideline developers. Cliff Goodman from the Lewin Group will speak to the results of the analysis and will provide a summary of the principles for payer and HTA use of device real-world evidence. The conclusion of MDIC's real-world evidence landscape assessment happened to coincide with the repeal of CMS's MCIT, Medicare Coverage for Innovative Technologies, back in November of last year. As you may be aware, CMS indicated that it was open to exploring other coverage pathways that balance access to innovative medical devices and appropriate patient safeguards that benefit Medicare patients. In January of this year, CMS began promoting town halls for February and March that discussed MCIT 2.0, or TCET, Transitional Coverage for Emerging Technologies, essentially a replacement or reboot for MCIT. Today, after the conclusion of two listening sessions conducted by CMS, Steve Farmer, Chief Strategy Officer from CMS, will elaborate on the steps that they are taking to help better achieve the goals of timely and predictable Medicare coverage of devices that includes the role of real-world evidence. Today's session will conclude with a panel, a roundtable discussion that includes multiple stakeholder perspectives on the appropriate and applicable use of real-world evidence in payer coverage decision-making. CMS, FDA, commercial payers, and industry. I'm sure you will enjoy today's virtual real-world evidence forum. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Pamela, and welcome to our second Health Economics and Patient Value Forum on Real-World Evidence. MDIC's HEPV initiative expands on my personal passion, finding paths to bring appropriate technologies to healthcare with the right patient, right treatment, right setting, and right team as my personal North Star. As in other MDIC pillars, we foster collaboration and communication among key stakeholders, CMS and commercial payers, health technology assessment organizations, FDA, industry, and patient representatives. Our initiatives are overseen by the HEPV Steering Committee. To date, HEPV is focused on two sources of information: real-world evidence and patient perspective information. Each of these is addressed by a work group. Real-world evidence can facilitate value demonstration, identify essential elements needed to optimize outcomes, such as training, operational support, and post-intervention needs, as well as fill gaps when subpopulations may not have been adequately represented in clinical trials. Patient perspective information brings patient perspectives and risk tolerance in coverage and payment decisions. Participation on the work group is limited to MDIC members, but others may join work groups if interested. Today's program is sponsored by the HEPV Real World Evidence Work Group, chaired by Kimberly Sterling, who will join me in moderating our panel. Our goal is to enhance the use, acceptability, and incorporation of real-world evidence specifically into coverage and health technology assessment decision-making. Further details can be located on the MDIC website, and links will be posted. If interested, please contact us. I have the honor of introducing our distinguished speakers for today's program. I will be brief, as bios are available on the MDIC website, and I want to conserve our time for content and discussion. First, we are delighted to have Dr. Phil Adamson, Chief Medical Officer for the Heart Failure Division at Abbott, representing industry perspective on importance of real-world evidence for coverage decision-making. Industry understands that MCIT, Medicare Coverage for Innovative Technologies, was repealed in part due to limited specificity regarding real-world evidence expectations. As CMS develops its next proposal, the Transitional Coverage for Emerging Technologies, or TCET, industry wants to support with input and recommendations. Dr. Adamson is well suited to his topic today with extensive clinical trial, regulatory process, and reimbursement experience. He is a member of MDIC's Chief Scientific and Medical Officer Committee. Dr. Adamson, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much, Joe Carroll, and it's an honor to be here at the forum to provide the industry perspective for our discussion. I'm, as mentioned, Phil Adamson. I'm a Chief Medical Officer for the Abbott Heart Failure Division. And by way of disclosure, I am an employee of Abbott as well as a stockholder. So when we think about industry's perspective about evidence generation in this type of forum, we really have to examine what are the pressures and what are the goals that industry has to produce evidence. And certainly our bottom line, of course, is that innovation and innovative medical devices are designed specifically to improve, obviously, the quality of life and quantity of life of patients with a chronic disease. And that is the central piece of how we develop innovative products. I mean, if we develop widgets that don't help patients, that doesn't help us at all and doesn't help the patients. So when we have that task, our task is to develop evidence for FDA to assess safety and efficacy. Sometimes that data overlaps the needs for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to evaluate the reasonableness and the necessity of a novel intervention for people with a chronic disease. And then finally, we do have to address the community, and the community many times addresses the quality of care for people with a chronic disease by writing guidelines. And those guidelines assess the evidence in the literature. And all of these pieces work together to be successful in bringing an innovation from an ideation all the way to the patient's bedside. All of these things are pressures, and all of these things, of course, require a different approach to evidence development with some overlap. So let's look at that evidence and what we are required to produce to make that process go from an idea to an innovation that helps a patient's life. And first of all, the pilot data that's required to ensure that the investigation in a pivotal trial is very important. And that pilot data addresses general safety of an approach, especially in medical devices, which are unique and obviously different than pharma intervention and investigation. Implantation of a device requires that process to be vetted through a safety assessment prior to the pivotal evaluation. The pivotal evaluation or the pivotal trial then has to be designed with the adequate representation of the population for which the device or the innovation is intended, and assessing safety as well as supporting an effect. And I say an effect, as we'll see in a little bit, effect and effectiveness can be two different things, and that's an important piece of how we have to approach the development of evidence, both from a regulatory as well as a coverage decision-making process. Typically, the pivotal trials, as we all know, are randomized prospective clinical trials. And the randomized clinical trial concept remains the gold standard of how evidence is generated. But as we'll talk about, the type and design of randomized clinical trials in the medical device industry is very different than that in the pharma industry. And those differences sometimes are thought to be nuances, but are very important to consider. Other bits of data that are important are registry data, as well as real-world evidence that comes from a variety of databases to assess multiple different aspects of the evidence base that is required for acceptance in the societal, in the clinical society. So let's look directly at the gold standard. The gold standard, of course, as I mentioned, is the prospective randomized clinical trial. And in pharma, that almost always is a prospective double-blinded randomized clinical trial process in which placebo is simply a sugar pill that looks like the real pill. And in medical device industry, it's much more difficult to develop a prospective randomized placebo control trial because many times the device has to be implanted. And if you don't implant the device in the control group, then the control group knows that they're in the control group. And so now you have an unblinded design. So single-blinded designs many times are required to evaluate devices, for example, hemodynamic monitoring with an implantable pulmonary artery sensor, required implantation in both the treatment and control group, with the control group and the treatment group blinded as to their status, all implanted. But information that comes from the device was blinded to the investigator. So a single blinded design many times has to happen. Other trials, for example, COAPT with MitraClip, transcutaneous edge-to-edge repair of the mitral valve in patients with dilated cardiomyopathies. Again, those types of interventions require some level of cath lab time and difficulty in informed consent when patients know that they have a 50-50 chance of having a sham procedure versus an active intervention. So in order to deal with that kind of concept of single-blinded trials and other consequences of a device trial, many times the control group is not equal to the usual care group of the population from which we're sampling. So for example, in the GUIDE-HF trial evaluating pulmonary artery pressure sensing, the control group received telephone calls every 2 weeks for 3 months, and then every month thereafter through the duration of the 12 months that the patients were in the trial. Both the control and treatment group did. When I estimated what it would take to do that in my clinical practice in Oklahoma, I would have had to hire 20 people full-time in order to achieve what the control group received in that trial. That was not possible, obviously, in a clinical setting. So the control group in GUIDE-HF was not a usual care group, and that's what typically happens in a device trial. The other thing is that's important is that the results of medical device trials represent an average of an effect arising from heterogeneous site outcomes, and that amalgamation or averaging of an effect could represent results from a poorly performing site and from a very well performing site. Those types of issues are not present in pharma trials typically, but if a surgical intervention or a device-based intervention is required, many times that is dependent upon the non-protocol care pathways that are present in the sites participating in the trial. And I'm going to give you an example from the CHAMPION trial. One could ask, in the CHAMPION trial, in which patients were enrolled and implanted with a CardioMEMS sensor and pulmonary pressure monitoring was used to manage them, we saw that the effectiveness was somewhat different in a patient that was enrolled in an academic site versus a community site. Both sites had a significant benefit to the patient enrolled. And when we bring that together as an average, we have an average effect. If one looks, for example, at the sites less than 10 subjects enrolled versus those with more than 10 subjects enrolled, so experience, bringing that together, also has an impact. Why is this important? It's important because this has an influence, or it influences our estimate of generalizability to the overall population in which we have the innovation intended. And so when this is FDA approved and in the real world, it's very important that we assess that generalizability in a credible way that can build congruence with the point estimate of effect seen in the pivotal clinical trial. Another example, as I can share with you, is from the Momentum 3 trial. This examined the use of the HeartMate 3 left ventricular assist device in patients with advanced heart failure. You can see on the left here results from the clinical trial at 24 months. And on the right, you see from a registry called the INTERMACS registry, real world evidence. The patient population was actually sicker than what was studied in the Momentum trial, but the results in the real world were very much the same at 24 months in terms of survival as was seen in the pivotal trial. So this generalizability from a registry can generate congruence of effect and estimate and make us assured that the heterogeneity that might be present in a clinical trial is not influencing the generalized effect in the real world. As I mentioned, the clinical care pathways in a surgical trial, for example, can't be all written down in a clinical trial protocol, and placebo control is different. In fact, there's some disease states in which a device trial is impossible to perform, like shock. I mean, the equipoise of trying to get informed consent as well as clinical equipoise for what device to use in an immediate situation like shock is very difficult. So again, all of these may impair our ability to generalize the results of a randomized controlled trial. So what do we do? As I mentioned, real world evidence is very important, and we all know where that data can come from, and FDA has written a very nice guidance for the design and sources of data that can go into real world evidences. But the uses of real world evidence, of course, as I mentioned, is the generalizability of effect, but also safety can be evaluated by using adverse events from claims matrices, including Medicare claims, for example. This kind of evidence can really, I think, be supportive of continued evidence for coverage decisions and for surveillance of effectiveness after market approval. So let me conclude then to give what I think we've learned in the medical device industry, and my industry perspective here is that it's incredibly important to incorporate all the things we've talked about into early engagement of both the regulatory agencies as well as the payer agencies. So bringing FDA, bringing CMS coverage groups together to discuss trial design, what are the endpoints that are meaningful, how can they be changed, what's meaningful to each of these groups, what would generate evidence to support safety as well as necessity, and what methods should be employed. Post-approval FDA and CMS evaluations can already be talked about at trial design. What kind of studies could be supportive of device use as well as post-market evaluation? And I think we'll see I hope we call for future guidance from regulators and payers. I think coordinating the FDA and CMS payers and regulators is very important. As the questions are different, we hope that we can do clinical trials that meet the needs of both agencies as we perform them, rather than trying to retrofit a database into those expectations. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today. And I look forward to our panel later to discuss any questions that might come up.
Thank you, Dr. Adamson. In 2021, the HEPV Real World Evidence Workgroup commissioned a landscape assessment of how CMS, commercial U.S. health plans, health technology assessment organizations, and other decision makers currently use real world evidence, as well as recommendations to enhance its value and adoption. For our next presentation, I'm very happy that Dr. Cliff Goodman from the Lewin Group is here to share key findings and recommendations for industry from the outstanding work he and his team have done. Dr. Goodman, we appreciate your expertise.
Well, good day, all. This is Cliff Goodman from the Lewin Group. Glad to be with you today. I'm going to report on a major section excerpt from our report, Payer and HTA Perspectives on Real-World Evidence for Medical Devices, conducted on behalf of the MDIC HEPV initiative. This is an excerpt from our final report. The main sections of our final report are as you see them. First, we started out with a rather broad landscape assessment. Then we followed with a set of 15 in-depth interviews with payers, health technology assessment organizations, and selected others. Furthermore, the report generated several case examples of real-world evidence in medical device coverage. And two final sections. One was on principles for payer and HTA use of device RWE, sort of synthesized from the previous work, as well as a set of recommendations for improving development and use of device RWE, also synthesized from the previous work. But today, we're going to take a special look at the principles for payer and HTA use of device RWE. Let's get started. First, as I said, in addition to the landscape assessment, we ran a set of interviews. There were 15 organizations represented. You can see there CMS, FDA, CDRH, several commercial or private sector payers, 2 integrated delivery networks, 1 from the employer community, and 5 health technology assessment organizations that are active in this field, including 1 from state government. We also interviewed in quite depth one RWE methodologist, a researcher in health technology. I might add that several of our other interviewees were rather quite expert as well in RWE methods and so forth. These were conducted using a structured interview guide, but the discussions were unstructured, kind of going with the flow for the main issues that the interviewees wanted to address, trying to cover as much of that territory as possible. Most of the interviews were an hour long. One was a little shorter, and a few were longer than an hour. One was as long as 90 minutes. And consistent with the requests from nearly all the non-government interviewees, names and organizations of interviewees were anonymized. But let's get to the findings here. So let's take a look at principles for payer and HTA use of device RWE that flowed from our landscape assessment and interviews. Here's the set of 11. And I'll just go down the list briefly here, and then we'll get to each one individually. And again, these are principles to help inform and educate payers and HTA bodies regarding how to evaluate and apply medical device RWE. And our 11 topics are as follows. And think of this as speaking to the payer and HTA communities. First, recognize the diverse RWE applications. Second, know that certain study designs are fit for purpose. Third, use the best evidence approach. Fourth, do recognize the complementary roles of post-market RWE and pre-market evidence. Next, support high-quality registries. Sixth, incorporate selected non-traditional real-world data. 7, consult existing guidance, frameworks, and standards for real-world data and real-world evidence. 8, apply the same quality standards to payer-sourced real-world evidence. We'll get into that in a bit. 9, enable early meetings with manufacturers. 10, explore appropriate implementation of unique device identifiers. And finally, support and participate in real-world data networks. So those are the sort of 11 principles that we're going to review now. Let's go to the first. And there's a couple slides here. First, recognizing diverse RWE applications. Keep in mind, again, we're talking to payers and HTAs. RWE can be used in multiple ways to assess and otherwise support decision-making pertaining to medical devices in routine or community settings. Real-world evidence can help to answer several questions. For example, how do effectiveness, particularly patient outcomes and safety, in real-world community care populations compare to those in pivotal clinical studies? I think this audience knows that there's a difference there. To what extent are the patients in pivotal clinical trials representative of particular beneficiary populations? How do effectiveness and safety vary between patients in pivotal clinical studies and particular patient subpopulations in real-world settings? And there are others. One has to do with demographic factors, making sure you've got those right. Also, insofar as aspects of device performance, might that performance vary according to delivery setting, who the provider is, or their experience? So that's just a beginning set, continued, asking questions about long-term safety and effectiveness that you can't get from pivotal RCTs, perhaps expanding indications based on effectiveness and safety. What about the long-term durability of the device? The long-term may not be captured in those shorter trials. What about variations in the delivery of device that might offer potential quality improvements, comparative costs, information for outcomes-based or value-based purchasing arrangements, and how might real-world evidence and experience be used to modify the design of devices or how devices are delivered or used in real-world practice, maybe also to generate research hypotheses, inform the design of subsequent clinical trials, and so forth. So the point here is that RWE has quite a few different sorts of applications. Let's think broadly about what those are. Next, let's go to study designs fit for purpose. It's always a good idea to remind folks about this, that RCTs are not the appropriate primary study design for all evidence questions. Other study designs, including some that generate or draw from real-world data, are preferred for certain questions. For example, on prognosis, on risk factor identification, on diagnostic test accuracy, for example, where a cross-section or cohort or case control study may be the more appropriate design. Complication rates of surgeries, incidence of rare delayed adverse events through, let's say, surveillance or registries, and the safety or effectiveness of incrementally modified technologies posing no known additional risk. Maybe a registry is the right way to go about that. So think about study designs as they might be fit for purpose. Furthermore, what we've found is that there are a variety of tools. If you are looking at alternative study designs, you don't have to do this from scratch. There are a variety of tools that rate the quality of particular study designs for generating real-world data and related documentation reporting, for example, the quality of the study. So you see the list there: GRACE, Quadus 2, QUIPS with Robbins Eye, START, the START RWE, Strobe and Trend are a bunch of tools that may be very useful for payers, HTAs, and frankly, other stakeholders to really have a careful look at the quality, the applicability of real-world evidence. Keep in mind, as noted at the bottom, that in some instances, available RCTs of efficacy and safety are of low quality or have other limitations, as you see there. And so in such instances, RWE from large observational studies, drawing on claims, electronic health records, registries, or other sources, really can represent the patient population of interest. They may be of longer duration, greater follow-up, and exhibit consistent clinically meaningful treatment effects that may be of greater value than are available from RCT. So do keep those in mind. And of course, we all know the various potential weaknesses of real-world data, real-world evidence. We never lose sight of that. But in many instances, a real-world data study design is going to be a better fit than looking at the top of the evidence hierarchy for RCTs. All right, the best evidence approach, really important here. Speaking of looking at evidence hierarchies, the best evidence approach refers to using and qualifying the best quality evidence that is available for consideration, rather than going right to reports on study designs at the top of the conventional evidence hierarchies, saying, I'm only going to use RCTs or systematic reviews of RCTs. Not always the best approach. The best evidence approach allows for considering less rigorous study designs when the evidence from more rigorous study designs is unavailable or maybe of poor quality or less relevant for a particular circumstance. So proceeding to evidence from clinical trials that may not have randomized controls, certain prospective observationals, and so forth may be the best fit, i.e. the best available evidence. And when we do move down the traditional evidence hierarchies, you still got to keep in mind and account for the potential biases and confounders that may be associated with those study designs. So the best possible evidence that you could conceive of may not be available. Go with the best available evidence, as noted here. And there are a couple more points to be made here that, RWE from study designs other than RCTs can be particularly useful when we weigh the trade-offs of internal validity versus external validity. Keep those in mind. Also, the best available evidence for a given insured or beneficiary population in community practice may not come from the optimal study type for internal validity. So you may need to go outside that to better capture the population of interest to you, to the decision maker. Now, let's recognize the complementary roles of post-market RWE and pre-market evidence. So RWE complements traditional pre-market evidence, complements it, of effectiveness and safety. The availability and increasing rigor of real-world data are these days really rebalancing the relative utility of pre-market and post-market evidence. So keep in mind that pre-market evidence that's generated for market clearance or approval of devices for labeled indications can be limited regarding sample size, patient heterogeneity, follow-up, the setting of care, and other factors. And so certain accelerated approvals of devices, important point, and other regulated technologies may be placing greater limitations on the usefulness or relevance of pre-market data for informing payment decisions. So to the extent that devices come through on an accelerated pathway or fewer evidence requirements actually places a greater burden on and desirability of drawing on real-world data sources to complement those data sets generated pre-market. Furthermore, large observational real-world data sources, digital applications for linking these, and related analytical tools are increasingly capable of filling some of those gaps and maybe even extending evidence-based indications where warranted. You can get larger sample size, greater patient heterogeneity, specifying standard of care and other comparators in the real world, diversifying care settings, longer follow-ups, and detecting rare or delayed adverse events. And so this is some important, these are some important aspects of why to try this route. And by the way, there's some very interesting early work being done on evaluating the concordance between RCTs and observational studies using claims, electronic health records, and comparing that with the generalizability of RCT populations with the real-world target population. So a lot of very interesting work to be watching along the way. Let's go to supporting high-quality registries. Certain registries of medical and surgical procedures, devices, and diseases or conditions have indeed become essential and well-qualified sources of RWE. However, there is great still unmet potential of registries to support RWE to help inform coverage and other policies and decisions. And payers and HTA groups can themselves contribute to the development, support, and use of such registries. And I know a lot of folks in our audience today are familiar with some of these registries, sponsored by certain medical professional societies and collaborative arrangements. You see a whole string there of medical professional societies. Certainly the work done by the Society of Thoracic Surgeons is well known. The American College of Cardiology, their work is well known. And for particular integrated delivery network, Kaiser Permanente has its national implant registries or a variety of others. Furthermore, when you think about high quality registries, not just any registries, there are guidelines and recommendations how to do registries right. So the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality has a very good document. Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, PCORI's got one, and so forth. Certainly the Medical Device Registry Task Force, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, and others. And so there's a lot of good work being done there on where you get a registry and how you make sure that its quality is appropriate. What about incorporating selected non-traditional real-world data? Well, payers and HTA groups can enhance and enrich the evidentiary bases of their assessments and decisions by recognizing and considering certain new, evolving, and other non-traditional sources. So in addition to claims, electronic health records, registries, and others, various non-traditional sources are emerging as important when you want to assess real-world outcomes or determinants or risk factors for those. And so what are these? Well, laboratory test results, biobanks, genomic and other molecular data, vital statistics, sociodemographic data, social determinants of health. We've heard from a bunch of our interviewees that they're more open to hearing about how such aspects affect their population from housing, food security, transportation, environmental, broadband, internet access, and so forth. And of course, we're all familiar with these still emerging and proliferating patient-generated data from personal phone, computer apps, social media, and so forth. So keeping our minds open to not just the traditional sources, but emerging non-traditional sources to really tell us a lot more about the patient experience. Let's go to number 7. Good idea to consult existing guidance, frameworks, or other standards for RWD and RWE. Payers, HTAs, and other stakeholders can consult a growing set of credible resources for developing and assessing RWD and RWE. Now, just a few to date of these focus specifically on medical devices per se. Most address certain methodological and other aspects that do apply across different types of healthcare technology, even if they aren't written with devices as a target technology. So some examples of principles and best practices for the design, conduct, and reporting of real-world evidence. ISPOR and the National Pharmaceutical Council, along with Duke Margolis, has this real-world evidence transparency initiative. It includes addressing improving transparency to build trust in real-world secondary data studies, a structured template and reporting tool for real-world evidence. That's the START RWE tool. Furthermore, CMTP had its effectiveness guidance documents for specific diseases and technologies. The IMI, the Innovative Medicines Initiative as well. And certainly a little closer to home, some frameworks for assessing the methodological rigor and quality of RWD and RWE. The FDA guidance document on the use of RWE to support regulatory decision-making for medical devices. The framework for FDA's real-world evidence program a couple of years ago. MDIC has its in vitro diagnostic RWE framework. NEST has its data quality framework, and NEST also has a research methods framework. All these are pretty recent, 2020, really solid documents. And then a very nice article was written by Jackson et al. Called The Organized Structure of Real-World Evidence Best Practices. So a bunch of really good sources here, more broadly for RWD and RWE, and focusing in a little closer on medical devices. Now, here's an interesting one that came up among some of our interviewees. And the idea was, payers draw on their own or other proprietary real-world data from claims and EHRs to derive real-world evidence. They should apply the same principles and best practices for the design, conduct, and reporting of real-world evidence that they would apply to RWE submitted from other sources. Well, what are these principles? And again, keep this in mind. There's some payers with very, very large databases of claims in the EHRs. They're using them increasingly. Some of them are linking the claims in the EHRs and other sources for their own internal studies. But whether it's coming from the outside or the inside, keep in mind, did you pre-register your research protocols? Have you used an appropriate study design for the evidence questions? Is there adequate representation of your target population? Have you accounted for potential biases and confounders? What about various data gaps that we know can arise? Any peer review? What about transparency regarding the sponsorship and potential conflicts of interest? So this is a friendly reminder to the payer and other communities that if you're using your own data sources or conducting your own studies in RWE, please try to apply the same standards across the board. Let's go to number 9, enabling early meetings with device manufacturers. Early meetings of payers and HTA groups with manufacturers and the collaborating researchers and innovators can improve the efficiency and utility of the evidence generated. The main purpose of these meetings is to review mutual expectations and plans for pre-market and or post-market evidence generation. Early meetings can address, well, for example, the relative roles of pivotal studies and post-market real-world data, clinical and other study designs and related aspects of methodological rigor, maybe use RWE for control arms or standards of care in clinical studies, and the sources and quality of real-world data. And these can be conducted as early as the product development, prior to regulatory clearance or approval, following regulatory clearance or approval, or even subsequently regarding potential expansion of labeled indications. The exchanges conducted in these early meetings are for mutually beneficial awareness and typically are not binding on the participating parties. Please keep that in mind. And the ability of payers and HTA groups to conduct these early meetings and their scope and other conditions are subject to applicable regulations and policies, which may vary. Let's go to number 10. Think about the exploration of appropriate implementation of unique device identifiers. We know that the implementation of UDIs in electronic health records and claims can support the generation of device model-specific post-market evidence on real-world comparative effectiveness and safety and other RWD and RWE uses. UDIs can improve the ability to distinguish devices for their effectiveness, safety, and other aspects of performance. Broader implementation of UDIs can assist in reducing medical error and improving patient safety, device recalls, and so forth. Keep in mind that although FDA published a final rule in 2013 requiring manufacturers to include UDIs on medical device labels, and certain moves have been undertaken to provide for entry of UDIs into claims in EHRs, various hurdles to implementation remain. So UDI is something still in play here. There are a lot of advocates for the upside, what they can accomplish, and they can really make a difference when you're looking at real-world data, real-world evidence for devices, device types, and models, an important consideration. Finally, number 11 here, support and participate in real-world data networks. So payers and HTA groups can benefit from participating in or arrangements with networks and other collaborations of organizations that compile and share real-world data. Network RWD offers such advantages as larger sample sizes, greater representation of geographies, patient heterogeneity, and care settings. And all these can help to inform and shape coverage policies. And the utility of these networks, sometimes in so-called federated models, is enhanced when they can access multiple RWD types. Claims, EHRs, pharmacy lab, registries, and so forth have common data standards, data models, and terminology. And even better, to enable linkages across data types and to conduct shared analyses. And some examples of real-world data networks and collaborations include the following, certainly at the top of the list, the NEST Collaborating Center Research Network, FDA Sentinel is an example, the OHDSI, the Observational Health Data Sciences and Informatics, Procurnet, there are a couple others, TriNetX, and Clinarion. These are examples of RWE networks and collaborations. So those are 11 principles that we kindly suggest and recommend to our payer and HTA colleagues. Here are some selected references and principles that were cited in the above mentioned slides. So with that, I hope that this will provide a lot of good grist for discussion, and look forward to hearing from you in the future if you'd ever like to follow up. So good luck with your future deliberations today. Thanks, everybody. Great to work with you.
Thank you, Dr. Goodman. In 2006, CMS launched coverage with evidence development as a pathway to a national coverage decision. We are very happy to have Dr. Emily Zeitler with us today to share the findings of her paper published earlier this month, Analysis of 26 CED Technologies Undertaken Between 2005 and 2020. Dr. Zeitler is an electrophysiologist and assistant professor of medicine at Dartmouth. Welcome, Dr. Zeitler.
Hi, I'm Emily Zeitler, and I'm really excited to be here with Medical Device Innovation Consortium for the Real World Evidence Forum. And I'm particularly excited that there was such vision to recognize the Coverage with Evidence Development program as a really important source of real world evidence lessons to be learned. And so I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking about some key takeaways and practical considerations from the Coverage with Evidence Development program. I'm going to start just getting us all on the same page and reviewing the Coverage with Evidence Development program in general, or the CED program. CED is a very specific type of national coverage determination made by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services for Medicare beneficiaries. Within a CED, it is a national decision that covers a promising therapy or service for all Medicare beneficiaries at a national level on the condition that data collection is ongoing. This is a relatively rare way that Medicare covers a therapy or service. You can see in the graph here that it happens 1 or 2 or 3 times a year on average, but most years it's really somewhere between 0 and 2 of these are decided. The program was formally established in 2006 with a formal guidance document by CMS, but the program does have its roots a few years prior to that, during which time there were some covered services and therapies which were covered on the condition of other sorts of data collection mechanisms or facility requirements that were the precursor to the modern CED program. Since the CED program was started nearly 2 decades ago, there's been some significant program variability during that time with regard to the therapeutic area, which ranged from neurology to cardiology and various other therapy areas. There's also been a lot of variability with regard to how data are collected in this space. The most common sources being clinical trials and registries. Importantly, any data collection mechanism within a CED has to be approved by Medicare, and there is some oversight involved in that once it has been approved. There's also been quite a bit of variability in what happens to these therapies and services within a CED. So the solutions or the outcomes of a CED, sometimes called the cycle of CED, can end with removal of the CED requirements, where the national coverage decision is ongoing, the therapy or service is still covered, but the coverage with evidence requirements are retired or withdrawn. On the other hand, the CED as part of an NCD can be completely revoked, and coverage can be deferred to local decisions, which, as many of you likely know, that is the most common way that therapies and services are covered by Medicare in the first place, by local contractors. So there's been quite a bit of variability with this program over the course of its 20 or 18 to 20 years. And I'm going to go through some details of that in the forthcoming slides. This represents the entire universe of coverage with evidence development. There's a lot listed here, and I'm going to go through just a few of the therapies listed here to highlight some interesting aspects of the program, but there will be time later to go into more detail with a few case studies. I'll start with carotid artery stenting, which was a therapy that was covered by CED in 2005. When it was covered, it was obviously one of the first therapies covered through the CED program. And after 4 years of data collection through clinical trials and the registry, it was converted to a national coverage decision without CED requirements. Another example is cochlear implantation. This is a device used for hearing impaired. It's an implantable device for the hearing impaired. And while this was also established in 2005 and is currently ongoing, it is currently undergoing review. So it has been a review of the coverage decision has been triggered, and it remains to be seen what will happen with this therapy. ICD for primary prevention, also one of the early therapies that was incorporated into the CED program. I'm going to go into some more detail with this therapy as one of the case studies, so I won't spend a lot of time here other than to say that it was converted to an NCD without CED requirements 12 years after the initial determination. Artificial hearts will also be subject to a case study a bit later. Suffice it to say at this point that the NCD was completely revoked 13 years after it was established, and the decision to cover artificial hearts was deferred to local contractors. Same can be said for home oxygen for cluster headaches. Also cover this in a bit more detail. For this one, 10 years after the CED, the NCD was revoked and therapy coverage deferred to local contractors as well. MRI and MRA for patients with implantable devices was converted to an NCD without CED requirements 7 years after it was established. Transcatheter aortic valve replacement was established in 2012. This is an ongoing CED, but interestingly, transcatheter aortic valve replacement, or TAVR, was subject to subsequent reconsiderations, and the CED, as part of the NCD, evolved during that time through the lessons learned and the evidence developed as part of the CED. Those lessons were incorporated back into the coverage, and I will go into a bit more detail about that. It's a nice story of how data can be repurposed for multiple indications. Autologous blood products for non-healing wounds. For this therapy, the CED requirements were dropped. There is still an NCD for this therapy, but it was revised and limited in some ways. Transcatheter mitral valve repair, which was later, the name was changed to transcatheter edge-to-edge repair, or TEER, is also an ongoing CED with some interesting characteristics, since the the real world evidence collected as part of the CED has undergone some changes since it was established based on stakeholder feedback. And we'll hear more about this later. Leadless pacemakers is an interesting example as part of the CED program. In this case, this is one of the more recent CEDs established in just 2017. And in this case, the evidence collection as part of the CED is performed using existing data sources. In this case, Medicare claims data, which is being used not only to address requirements for post-approval study for the FDA, but also for these evidence development requirements by CMS. So it represents an evolution in data sources for reflecting increasing reliance on real-world evidence. And then finally, monoclonal antibodies for Alzheimer's disease. This decision was just finalized a couple of weeks ago. I think it remains to be seen what we will learn from this example and how it will feed back into the CED program in general. I'd like to highlight some aspects of CED and the associated real-world evidence by going through a few case studies. The first one is the ICD for primary prevention. As I mentioned before, this was established in 2005. It reflected a relatively large Medicare population. It also reflected a pretty consolidated professional and commercial or industry communities. And this came right on the heels of some high-profile, high-quality, randomized controlled trials that were published in the early 2000s. And so the evidence generated by those randomized trials was, of course, noticed by payers, including Medicare, but they had ongoing or unanswered questions related to how these findings from randomized controlled trials would or would not translate to the Medicare population. Would the real world or the outcomes in the real world, would those reflect what was seen in these highly selective and well-controlled randomized clinical trials? And this reflects the primary unanswered questions that were enumerated in the decision memo from 2005. This led to the development of the National Cardiovascular Data Registry, the NCDR-ICD registry, which now represents a suite of registries which are primarily facilitated by the American College of Cardiology in partnership with a number of other stakeholder groups and professional societies. I'm including a snapshot here of the first page of the NCDR-ICD registry data collection form as a way to emphasize that this can be a significant disruption to workflow. In many cases, data collection for this registry is done by hand, by operators or by research coordinators at the facilities that implant these devices. Despite that workflow disruption or administrative burden, there was nearly 100% compliance with this requirement, not just for Medicare beneficiaries, but for all ICD recipients. Data were entered into the ICD registry. In many cases, this is because it was easier just to enter the data for every patient than it was to try and differentiate at the point of care who was and wasn't a Medicare beneficiary, in which case the data collection would be compulsory. Now, that being said, there was nearly 100% compliance, and the data that were collected, the real world data that were collected as part of this registry, became available through a formalized RMP committee at ACC, at American College of Cardiology, which would make the data available to answer questions posed by scientists, and as well as the questions that were listed or enumerated in the decision memo itself. In 2018, the NCD was reconsidered and the CED requirements were dropped in recognition that the outstanding questions enumerated in 2005 had been answered by this real-world data source. It's really a topic for another time, but in 2018, a shared decision-making requirement was added to the NCD. And that's a really interesting decision that certainly was somewhat controversial and outside the scope of what we'll talk about today. But what is within the scope of this is the lessons that were learned from the experience with the primary prevention ICD registry. So data collection was not minimally disruptive and did have administrative burden in many cases. And we know this because when the CED requirements were dropped in 2018, many facilities chose to no longer participate in the registry. And I think we can infer that this is because of the administrative burden and the disruption in the workflow that it caused in some cases in facilities that did not find ways to more easily incorporate it into their workflow. The NCDR-ICD registry has made significant efforts to improve the value added of the registry to the operators and the facilities that participate in the registry, and it remains to be seen whether that will be enough for facilities and operators to continue contributing to the registry, to continue to answer ongoing scientific questions and to perform quality improvement. Importantly, for this CED, it was pretty clear that there were champions emerging from the stakeholder groups. And these champions had, their incentives were well aligned. The operators, the patients, the regulators, manufacturers, all of the incentives among these stakeholders were well aligned around this narrow, unmet need of the Medicare beneficiary population. And this contributed to the way that this played out. I'm hesitant to use the word success because success could take on a lot of forms when it comes to coverage with evidence development. But in this case, this might be seen as a success because a registry was stood up and had high levels of participation, answered important scientific questions, and then the cycle was completed when those questions were answered and the requirements were dropped. A second case study is artificial hearts. This one was established in 2008, but this was a much smaller Medicare population, far less than 1% of the Medicare population. In fact, when CMS published the revocation of this NCD in 2021, part of the reason for that was that there simply was not enough data to support an ongoing national coverage decision for this therapy. In fact, from 2006 to 2017, just 450 patients were included in the data collection mechanism. And there was a single manufacturer, and there was a consolidated professional community. There were clear unanswered questions, but this really was not enough to overcome the very small beneficiary population that was at risk or potentially in need of this therapy. There was and because of that, there was significant variability in patient selection as well as outcomes. Unlike an ICD, which has pretty consistent patient selection and implantation outcomes, both short-term and long-term, this was much more variable among recipients of the artificial heart. So in 2021, as I mentioned, the NCD was revoked and coverage was deferred to local contractors. In this follow-up decision in 2021, one of the things stated by Medicare, which is quite interesting, is recognition that a national coverage decision actually offers less flexibility for coverage on a case-by-case basis, which would be really important in a situation like an artificial heart, when the clinical details on a case-by-case basis would make a big difference about whether a patient is more or less likely to benefit from the therapy. So lessons learned here was that assessment of eligible beneficiary population would have been very helpful a priori. So at the time of developing this policy, an understanding of how many patients were really at risk or would potentially benefit from this therapy might have given stakeholders a clue that this method for collecting evidence may not have been the ideal way to align patient access or beneficiary access with the evidence of the time. And in addition, this CED went on for more than 10 years without a clear rubric by which to assess progress on an ongoing basis. There was no timeline or pre-specified schedule for assessing progress. Had there been, there may have been an opportunity to re-examine the trajectory or the cadence of data collection, and might have been an earlier understanding that this strategy was not going to be successful to collect enough data quickly enough to align beneficiary access with evidence of the time. The next example is oxygen for cluster headaches. This CED was established in 2011, again, with clear outstanding questions outlined in the decision. But unlike the ones that we've discussed so far, this was a more diffuse patient group with less clear diagnosis. And there were no CED protocols submitted to CMS for consideration at any point during the 10 years that this CED was ongoing. Now, despite that, clinical evidence did accumulate in the scientific and peer-reviewed literature based on reflecting an examination of this therapy for cluster headaches, just not within the framework of CED. So when CMS reconsidered this NCD in 2021, they identified this evidence that had accumulated in the peer-reviewed literature outside of the CED paradigm, and based on that, determined that not only had no protocols been submitted, but there was very low likelihood that any protocols would be submitted due to poor feasibility that patients could be appropriately identified and enrolled in a trial or registry that could answer the questions that had been posed in the CED. So the lesson learned here was that if feasibility had been assessed a priori, there might have been an understanding earlier on that this mechanism would not be ideal for real-world evidence collection as part of the CED. So similar to what we just discussed with artificial hearts, where the population was quite small and that made it unfeasible, here it was identifying the patient population and enrolling them in an evidence collection mechanism of some kind was also determined to really not be all that feasible. And what that meant was this therapy was hard to come by for Medicare beneficiaries because they couldn't enroll. There was nothing to enroll in, no way to access this therapy. On the other hand, patients who maybe would have been harmed by this therapy also didn't have access to it. But the bottom line is there was no way to assess that because there were no protocols that were being monitored by CMS for the purpose of the CED. So I don't know if the cluster headache stakeholders were at the table at the time of developing this policy, but if they weren't, perhaps they should have been. Had these stakeholders been at the table, there may have been an earlier recognition that that CED would not be an effective way to gather the evidence needed to make a final determination about whether this therapy was reasonable and necessary for Medicare beneficiaries at a national level. To summarize some of the lessons learned, or to summarize really the therapies that that reach the end of the CED cycle one way or another, I'm presenting two tables. The first one is therapies where the NCD was revoked, and that is oxygen for cluster headaches and artificial hearts, where these NCDs were revoked for very different reasons, but both because it was clear at the end of the cycle that it was not going to be feasible to get enough information or to get the right kind of information in order to cover these therapies with an NCD. In addition, these therapies are really different. And so there aren't any clear characteristics that would make one predict or provide some predictive algorithm for which therapies will and would not ultimately have an NCD revoked as at the end of the CED cycle. And really the same can be said about this group of therapies. These are the 4 therapies where the CED requirements were removed. The NCD remained in place, but the evidence development was no longer a compulsory aspect of the coverage policy. There are some similarities, of course, between these therapies. For example, 3 of them sort of fall within the cardiology therapeutic area, but there are also a lot of differences. And so what I take away from both this table and the one before it is that the CED policy can be a very flexible mechanism. It's a flexible mechanism by which real-world evidence can be collected to further refine the alignment between beneficiary access to therapies and services with the evidence available at the time. No discussion of CED would be complete without a discussion of transcatheter aortic valve replacement, or TAVR. Now, a caveat here is that TAVR reflects a very unique set of circumstances, and it's not clear that the characteristics of TAVR could be easily, picked up, lifted, and moved over to another therapy in order to achieve the same end result. The unique set of circumstances are really kind of beyond the context of this conversation, But suffice it to say that there was already a infrastructure in place by which data could be collected in the post-market, CED space using the infrastructure of cardiovascular device-based registries that had come before it. In addition, there was a very clear unmet clinical need, and more than your typical unmet clinical need. Patients who were at prohibitively high risk for cardiac surgery, which was the standard of care for replacement of the aortic valve in the setting of aortic stenosis, patients at prohibitively high cervical risk had no options and were literally dying of this disease because there was no other way to treat them. So transcatheter aortic valve replacement met this very urgent and completely unmet clinical need. So there was a lot of momentum behind this technology. It was truly a breakthrough technology. So when the CED was established, it was established for this narrow group of patients with prohibitively high surgical risk for aortic valve replacement. Interestingly, the CED was revisited twice after that, once for patients with intermediate surgical risk, and then again for low risk. This reflects a successful mechanism for the collection of real-world evidence, both for meeting or addressing the outstanding questions posed by CMS, but also questions posed by FDA for label expansion. And so one of the main lessons here that, even though this is a unique circumstances, I think the lesson is really important, which is that the real world evidence collected for the registry for this therapy was multi-purposed. It was used for quality improvement with information fed back to operators and facilities in order to improve their protocols and patient selection, for example, but also for scientific inquiry, as well as label expansion through the FDA, and also, importantly, to meet the coverage requirements that were part of this CED. So again, unique circumstances, but the lesson of repurposing real-world evidence is one that we should take to heart. What does the future of CED look like? Well, I don't know, but we have some clues. A couple of weeks ago, CMS published finalized the most recent CED, which was for monoclonal antibodies for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. This was a bit unusual since there are not a lot of drugs that are covered through a CED. But it remains to be seen what lessons we'll learn from this unique situation. And it also remains to be seen whether the lessons learned from the largely device-based CEDs, whether those lessons will be incorporated into the development of the CED for monoclonal antibodies for Alzheimer's. And then how will CED evolve in general? The leadless pacemaker CED is a great example of using extant data sources, in that case, Medicare claims data. What other existing data sources could be used? There are many electronic health records, for example, especially in the new paradigm of substantially increased computing ability and artificial intelligence to extract relevant pieces of data from really large data sets like an electronic health record. Maybe that could be leveraged to meet evidence development requirements as part of CED or in any other context. And how will the lessons learned from CED, how will that be applied to future policies? I would argue that we would be absolutely silly not to really take to heart the lessons learned by CED, especially as we think about new policies related to emerging technologies. The one that comes to mind is the now repealed Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technologies, or MCIT, which we'll hear a bit more about from Steve Farmer coming up shortly. But one of the reasons why MCIT was repealed was because there was a lot of concern about the ability to collect real-world evidence or evidence of any kind during the period of transitional coverage of breakthrough devices. And without the ability to confidently collect data in that setting, then it would be very difficult, if not impossible, to make final decisions at the end of a transitional period about coverage. And also, of course, to make sure that Medicare beneficiaries or any other patients are being treated safely and timely and with the most evidence-based therapies. And so I think about it this way: when we throw out MCIT, we want to make sure that we're not also throwing out the lessons learned from CED, because there's so much to learn about real-world evidence development in that context. Now, I'm really enthusiastic and optimistic, because it seems pretty clear that CMS has no intention of throwing this baby out with the MCIT bathwater. In fact, there seems to be tremendous interest in incorporating these important lessons into whatever the future of this sort of policy looks like. The transitional coverage of emerging technologies, or TCET, is very likely to incorporate the lessons learned about real-world evidence development that we've gleaned from CED. So I do not think this is our reality. And with that, I'll stop. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about CED and the role that real-world evidence has played in this policy. And I look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zeitler. You provided the perfect context for our next speaker, Dr. Stephen Farmer. Dr. Farmer serves as the Chief Strategy Officer in the Coverage and Analysis Group at CMS, where he leads an effort to streamline and accelerate evidence-based coverage policy development. Today, Dr. Farmer will review the multiple factors and issues being considered by CMS as the agency looks to establish alternative expedited coverage pathways that balance access to innovative medical devices and appropriate safeguards. Dr. Farmer, thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon. I'm Steve Farmer, Chief Strategy Officer for Coverage at CMS. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. In my presentation, I'll review our current coverage options and discuss challenges we face with emerging technologies. I'll talk a bit about the existing coverage with evidence development pathway, and then I'll describe some new concepts we are exploring. I will conclude with some thoughts on the role of real-world evidence in coverage. I will note, though, that any new coverage pathway will be developed through an open and transparent process, and the concepts I talk about today may change. CMS serves the public as a trusted partner and steward, and we are dedicated to advancing health equity, expanding coverage, and improving health outcomes. Everything we do at CMS should be aligned with one or more of our 6 strategic pillars. Those pillars include advancing health equity by addressing health disparities, expanding access to quality, affordable health coverage and care, engaging our partners in the communities we serve throughout the policymaking and implementation process, driving innovation and promoting value-based, person-centered care, protecting our program's sustainability for future generations, and fostering a positive and inclusive workplace while promoting excellence in all aspects of CMS's operations. Evidence-based care is the hallmark of modern medical care and underpins the HHS CMS value mission. CMS is uniquely positioned to help set evidence-based care standards because of our national scope and because of our close relationships with the FDA, the NIH, and the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. Especially where evidence on emerging therapies is limited, we are able to get the best available expert guidance both in-house and from our partners. It is important to note that national coverage determinations don't just establish that an item or service will or won't be paid for. They also establish the context and circumstances in which they will be paid, which confers crucial beneficiary protections and promotes high-value care. On a related note, you cannot deliver value if treatments don't work, and if and how well they work may depend on the population treated and the setting where care is delivered. CMS coverage is an important factor, but certainly not the only one that determines whether new technologies succeed in the market. In a value-based world, those decisions are usually made by clinicians and health systems, and they will also want to see a compelling case that new technologies are beneficial. The Food and Drug Administration is responsible for clearing devices, approving drugs, and licensing biologics based upon a determination that they are safe and effective. By contrast, CMS may extend coverage to an item or service if the Secretary determines that it is reasonable and necessary under Section 1862A1A of the Social Security Act. These two standards are not synonymous. CMS offers coverage pathways at both the national level and the local levels. When making coverage determinations at either level, CMS has long considered whether the item or service is not just safe and effective, but also whether the item or service is not experimental or investigational and is appropriate for Medicare beneficiaries. At the national level, CMS completes 3 to 4 NCDs annually, on average. These follow a statutorily defined open and transparent process that includes a careful review of the evidence in 2 rounds of public comment. The process generally requires about 9 months to complete, but given the resources involved in developing NCDs, there is currently a wait list. However, while much of the focus has been on national coverage decisions, most decisions actually occur at the local level. There, approximately 37 unique LCDs are developed each year. I use the word unique because multiple MACs may address the same topic. LCDs are developed by Medicare administrative contractors and may vary between jurisdictions to some degree. LCDs also take approximately 9 months to complete. Lastly, when there is no NCD or LCD, Medicare administrative contractors may cover services through individual claim determination. For newly market authorized technologies, individual claim determinations may occur soon after FDA market authorization. Emerging technologies, especially breakthrough ones, may pose a particular challenge for prompt market access for a number of reasons. Firstly, Medicare is a defined benefit program. As a result, CMS must make a benefit category determination as a threshold issue before we can extend coverage for a new technology. Emerging technologies do not always neatly align with the existing categories, which were conceived many years ago. Secondly, national coverage determinations are open and transparent by law. They require a review of the published evidence to demonstrate benefit specifically for the Medicare population, and the available literature may be limited for emerging technologies. In addition, in many instances, there is no established standard of care for new products, and the ideal context of care may not be well established. It is also important to understand that when CMS proposes a decision, meaningful public participation necessarily takes time. Thirdly, new codes are established by several entities which are not well coordinated with FDA market authorizations for newly emerging technologies. While CMS could issue temporary codes, there are notable downsides. In the context of fit-for-purpose study designs, for example, one important consideration is that use of temporary codes may complicate studies that rely on administrative claims, where coding specificity and consistency are crucial. Dr. Zeitler just reviewed some elements of our historical experience with the CED pathway. NCDs may nationally cover items and services when they are found to be reasonable and necessary for the Medicare population. NCDs that include coverage with evidence development allow payment where services are promising, but the evidence remains incomplete and does not yet meet the reasonable and necessary threshold. While CMS believes that CED offers a pragmatic and balanced approach to coverage for promising technologies that do not yet meet the reasonable and necessary threshold, we also recognize a number of the historical challenges that Dr. Zeitler raised. Over time, we have heard from stakeholders that eligibility for CED and the timing of opening of NCD-CED decisions may be unpredictable. We've also heard that evidence development requirements may be burdensome for stakeholders. Some manufacturers have argued that CED requirements are duplicative with FDA post-market authorization studies. And some stakeholders have argued that some CED decisions establish an open-ended evidence development requirement. In the final rule that repealed the MCIT pathway, CMS signaled our intention to extend timely access to high-value emerging technologies for our beneficiaries. We also committed to engaging with stakeholders when developing a replacement. We have already held 2 stakeholder meetings, and we have received some great feedback. In the first meeting, we kept the content general, and we heard a broad range of comments. We heard stakeholder concerns about a number of challenges manufacturers face when transitioning from FDA market authorization to gaining meaningful market access. We also heard from stakeholders what they would like to see in a replacement pathway. At a high level, some commenters hoped it would include an agile and iterative review process. Other commenters wanted it to be flexible, transparent, predictable, and collaborative. And while evidence generation may be needed in some cases, we heard consistent interest in a pathway that allows for fit-for-purpose study designs. As stakeholders learned from MCIT, coverage is only one piece of the puzzle. We also heard an interest in finding a way to better coordinate benefit category determinations, coding assignments, and payment values, all of which are required for beneficiary access to new technologies. In light of extensive public feedback, CMS is exploring a range of considerations in a TSET pathway. While we are exploring these concepts, I want to emphasize that all regulations are developed through an open and transparent process, and any of these elements may be subject to change. In the pre-market period, we are exploring whether manufacturers would find it helpful to have greater clarity on which study endpoints would be of greatest interest to CMS. If further evidence development is needed, we are also considering whether CED study requirements should be updated. CMS is working toward closer collaboration with the FDA so that we can better predict and plan for the pipeline of new technologies. For example, it would be helpful to know the most likely product labeling, as well as the rough timing of market authorizations early enough that we can be prepared. We are also exploring how, if evidence development is needed, we can better align CED and FDA post-market study requirements. In terms of manufacturer engagement, we have long provided extensive feedback on investigational device exemption studies, which is well upstream from FDA market authorizations. We are now also exploring whether early feedback on the state of the published evidence would be helpful closer to FDA market authorization. That review could offer greater transparency to manufacturers and CMS on the state of the evidence and any notable evidence gaps, particularly for Medicare beneficiaries. After market authorization, if evidence gaps have been noticed or noted, we are exploring whether it would be helpful for manufacturers to propose a specific evidence development approach. The MCIT pathway covered specific breakthrough devices, but did not address subsequent similar market entrants. In fact, the MCIT pathway could have established an uneven playing field that favored the first-to-market device, even if subsequent entrants provided superior outcomes. Iterative refinements to devices are common after FDA market authorization. Coverage specific to the individual device could also have posed challenges if those refinements fell outside of the original FDA marketing application. An alternative pathway could instead cover a class of devices that better allows for both iterative refinements and subsequent market entrants. The coverage to class approach could also allow for off-label coverage within an approved study. Lastly, CMS is exploring whether a transitional coverage pathway should pre-specify a date when CMS will reassess the evidence through an updated systematic literature review. That updated review could offer greater clarity to stakeholders about the status of the NCD and could inform CMS about whether an NCD reconsideration is merited. I'd like to comment further on a few of these concepts. If CMS published outcome and duration of follow-up expectations within therapeutic areas, manufacturers could address those expectations in pivotal clinical studies. For example, even if manufacturers gain FDA market authorization on the basis of intermediate outcomes and over a shorter time frame, they could potentially continue longer-term follow-up of clinical outcomes in the treatment and control cohorts, even after FDA market authorization. That longer-term follow-up could conceivably combine the rigor of a randomized control trial with the lighter touch in the post-marketing phase, potentially leveraging real-world evidence. Even so, other fit-for-purpose study designs are also possible after FDA market authorization. CMS could also propose a focused systematic literature review in the pre-market period and could note any evidence gaps. To be clear, a focused systematic literature review would not constitute a national coverage analysis, but that review could offer more clarity and transparency after about potential coverage options. After FDA market authorization, and if a national coverage analysis is opened, manufacturers could propose an evidence development approach to close any evidence gaps identified in the pre-market systematic literature review. That evidence development approach might include either a conventional clinical study or a fit-for-purpose study design. The manufacturer could also propose the conditions that would optimize outcomes for Medicare beneficiaries. This flow diagram illustrates how these components could work together. A manufacturer could engage CMS, preferably at some point prior to FDA market authorization, to request an evidence review. If appropriate, CMS could then initiate a focused evidence preview of the published literature that could inform a CMS sponsor meeting about the state of the evidence. Based on that conversation, the manufacturer could then have a better sense of their coverage options. If the evidence is robust and evidence gaps are minor, the next step might be to make a formal NCD request. Alternatively, if the evidence is promising, but important gaps remain, the manufacturer may make a formal NCD request with the understanding that they will likely need to propose an evidence development approach soon after the NCD analysis is opened. Lastly, if the manufacturer chooses not to make an NCD request, they would remain at MAC discretion, which could result in either an LCD or multiple LCDs or individual claim determinations. We held our second stakeholder meeting on March 31st and sought more focused feedback on several of the elements I've just described. We first asked whether, within specific therapeutic areas, guidance on CMS appropriate outcomes and follow-up durations would be helpful. Stakeholders generally supported this idea. On the second question, we asked stakeholders about the optimal timing of CMS engagement. Most stakeholders suggested that very early engagement is preferable. I would note, though, that while CMS already provides extensive feedback on investigational device exemption studies, a systematic literature review would not be especially helpful before the results of pivotal clinical studies are known. Our third question addressed the concept of a collaborative review process. Again, stakeholders generally saw the value of engagement prior to FDA market authorization, including a focused evidence preview that summarizes the state of the evidence and any important gaps. They were also strongly supportive of the idea of proposing fit-for-purpose evidence development approaches to address any of those identified evidence gaps. Lastly, we asked about whether a pathway should ideally cover individual devices or cover a class of devices. Here too, stakeholders generally supported a coverage to class approach. Though responses were nuanced, most stakeholders recognized that privileged coverage status for the first to market breakthrough device could result in an uneven playing field and impede beneficiary access to the best available technology. As I mentioned, there is a great deal of stakeholder interest in fit-for-purpose study designs, and in many ways, conventional and fit-for-purpose studies are complementary. Conventional studies are often needed to establish the safety and efficacy of a device, but they are often conducted under carefully specified conditions and often at highly experienced medical centers. Given their costs, conventional studies often have smaller sample sizes and study patient populations, and study patients for relatively shorter timeframes. Because of their smaller size, they often have limited generalizability to the Medicare population. That lack of generalizability may stem from limited inclusion of Medicare eligible beneficiaries. Overall, insufficient enrollment of women or underrepresented minorities, or study inclusion and exclusion criteria that are not reflective of the Medicare population. By contrast, fit-for-purpose studies examine performance of devices in the real world in a broader range of settings and with broader range of clinicians. Because these designs often make use of secondary data, they can often include larger and more diverse patient groups, and they can study outcomes over longer timeframes in a more cost-effective way. CMS is exploring whether the current coverage with evidence development study requirements need to be refreshed to support a broader range of high-quality clinical study designs. CMS does not currently have specific guidance for fit-for-purpose study designs. Nonetheless, I can offer some general comments on how I personally think about them. Firstly, it is important to recognize that fit-for-purpose study designs must still meet CMS's long-standing, rigorous evidence quality standards. Secondly, not all topics can be addressed entirely through secondary use of administrative claims or electronic health record data. For example, if critical data elements are inconsistently documented or require adjudication to be credible, they may require purposeful data collection. Alternatively, incorporation of patient-reported outcomes may require intentional patient outreach for both treatment and control groups, as well as a means of capturing the data and aligning it with the broader data set. A few general principles are also worth noting, and here, in the absence of CMS guidance, I'm again speaking only for myself. Study protocols should be posted or published in advance with pre-specified outcomes. Execution should be rigorous, transparent, and reproducible. Core robustness checks should also be pre-specified, though supplemental robustness checks may be needed once the primary data analysis is complete. The limitations of fit-for-purpose study design should be clearly identified, and to be considered by CMS, these studies must be published in peer-reviewed English language journals. So in conclusion, CMS is committed to enhancing access to high-value emerging technologies. We are also mindful that they may have unknown or unexpected risks, and we are required to ensure that emerging technologies improve health outcomes for our beneficiaries. We repealed the MCIT final rule because of concerns that provisions in the rule may not have been sufficient to protect Medicare patients. We are now exploring coverage process improvements that will enhance access to innovative and beneficial medical devices in a way that better suits the healthcare needs of our beneficiaries. We have already held 2 public meetings to gather stakeholder feedback on potential elements of the new pathway. But note again that under the law, any new pathway will be established through an open and transparent process, and the considerations I discussed today may change in that process. I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
CMS is an important payer in US healthcare. However, MDIC wanted to understand what policies and initiatives were being considered or implemented among commercial payers. We discovered Highmark's Vital Innovations Program, which was first launched in 2015. This provides the missing link between FDA approval of a new medical technology and its reimbursement by commercial insurers. With me today, we have Eileen Rogers, Director of Highmark's Vital Program, and Deborah Rosenthal, the founding CEO of FreeSpira, which is an FDA-cleared digital therapeutic treatment used to reduce or eliminate symptoms of panic disorder, panic attacks, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Deborah also serves as Vice Chair of the Digital Therapeutic Alliance. Eileen, let me turn to you and ask you to please share more about the Vital program.
Yes, thank you so much, Joe Carroll, for that introduction. The Vital program, as you mentioned, has been in existence for the last 7 or so years. It came into existence as the result of Highmark Health becoming an integrated delivery and financing system, and us realizing through interactions with our clinicians and physicians that there was a need for a program that was able to identify promising new innovations that had passed FDA clearance, that were commercially available, they were patient safe and effective, and really were not going to be covered for years, and that needed longitudinal data according to what current payer reimbursement policy would be saying. So we knew philosophically as a system we could do better than that. Now that we had at our disposal, we had clinicians that were ready to champion the innovation, and we had members that we could have the intervention, and we had the data that we could develop into real world evidence that would show that we could benchmark the clinical outcomes from prior randomized clinical trials. And we could develop now the medical economic analysis, and really importantly, we could also show what the clinician and patient experience would be. We could take that real world evidence, and internally, we could develop the case for the innovations that really were going to make a difference in patients' lives. And that's how we started running quality improvement programs and identifying technologies like FreeSpira. And that's really how the program was born.
Thank you, Eileen. If I remember correctly, I believe FreeSpira was Vital's pilot initial program that was launched. Deborah, can you tell us a little about your journey with the Vital program?
Right. So I first heard about the Vital program from a colleague in 2015 who reached out to me, and I decided to talk to the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the Allegheny Health Network, which is a health system that's owned by Highmark, to determine whether or not he would sponsor our program. And sure enough, once he heard about the clinical trials, FreeSpira's prior clinical trials, and also he understood the cost of patients that suffer from panic disorder, he was definitely interested and said he would become the co-sponsor of our program, which was really important. So we were involved in the Vital program. We started in 2015 as the first company through the program, and then the program lasted until 2017. And at the time of the QIP, we had FDA clearance to treat panic disorder and panic attacks. We did not yet have FDA clearance to treat PTSD until 2018. Just a bit of a background about people that suffer from panic disorder and panic attacks. About 27 million Americans suffer from panic attacks annually. About 7 million have the diagnosis of panic disorder. This is kind of important in this whole discussion because people that have panic attacks often misinterpret their symptoms as a heart attack or some other type of cardiac event. They frequently go to the emergency department. They see their PCP many times a year, many diagnostic tests. So they're very expensive to the healthcare system. So our assumption going into this, into the Vital program, was that if a patient was no longer having panic attacks, that and going to the emergency department so frequently, that they wouldn't overutilize healthcare resources, and thus post-Frispera would actually have an overall drop in their medical cost. So that was our assumption. That was the hypothesis of our QIP. And we did that within the real world setting of Allegheny Health Network.
So Deborah, if I could ask, obviously demonstrating the savings is attractive to any health plan that's financially responsible. But if I understand you correctly, the financial targets were really a surrogate for your quality improvement program, that the fewer visits and reduction in medications, other associated costs were in fact for quality improvement first rather than financial. Is that correct?
Right. Well, it's super important. I mean, for a payer and for clinicians, they want to make sure that your product is going to, improve people's lives, that you will have the right clinical outcomes that make sense to the payer as well as to the provider and clinicians. So, the study was actually confirming and validating the clinical trials that we had done previously. The new part of this was the health economic piece, where Highmark was actually looking at the cost of their members for a year before they were treated with Frispera, and then a year after they were treated with Frispera, in order to determine if Frispera actually would reduce their overall medical spend. Maybe I should tell you about the results now while we're having that discussion. So Frispera is a 28-day program, a 28-day treatment. At the end of 28 days, 85% of the patients were panic attack free, 82% had symptom reduction. The adherence was quite strong. Patients completed 84% of the 56 protocol specified sessions that were required as part of this program. Important to remember is that Frispera is a 28-day program after which the patient has no access to Frispera. So it's, we have the sensor, we have the tablet, we have coaching, but after that 28 days, they no longer have access. So at 1 year post Frispera treatment, then 91% of patients still had symptom reduction. 68% of our patients were in remission, which means they didn't have the diagnosis of panic disorder at that point. But I'd say the most important part, because that's kind of what we're talking about, is the cost reduction. So at about a bit more than 1 year post-treatment, the Highmark cost reduction analysis, which included all the medical costs for emergency department, medication, physician visits, et cetera. So the overall reduction in medical cost was 35%, but really significant was there was a 65% reduction in the emergency department cost, which we kind of knew conceptually, but we were actually able to prove that once a patient was treated with Frispera and 1 year later, there was a 65% reduction in overall cost in the emergency department, and also a 68% reduction in medication use. So I can say Highmark was very happy with these results. We were happy with the results, and it allowed us to continue this collaboration with Highmark. I'll just say that it was really an incredible opportunity for a company like ours to be able to work with Highmark, because we knew from the beginning if we were successful in reducing the overall cost, that Highmark had committed that they would create medical policy coverage and payment for Frispera for their members, which is what they did.
Well, that's terrific. Eileen, I know there were some operational challenges in getting ready for this, the initial test run with Frispera. Can you share a little of the greater challenges you faced and how you dealt with them?
Yeah, absolutely, Joe Carroll. That's a great question. And I think over the course of, you had mentioned that Deborah's program and Frispera was the first into the VITAL program. And we benefited from them being such great collaborative partners. And I think we've learned that having identified great internal champions and like-minded innovation folks helps us identify how to work not only upfront to promote the program to folks that will embrace it early on, become clinical champions, and then, excuse me, also become advocates for the program and to continue to help us figure out how to work within the confines of the existing either workflows at the health system or workflows within the payer. And then to figure out how to push the boundaries of that, to figure out new ways to either reimburse it, how to cover it, how to promote it to the clinicians as a new tool for them to talk to their patients about. And so throughout the course of the quality improvement program, and then as we were transitioning into getting the medical policy coverage based on the evidence that we had developed, and then figuring out how to operationalize it, all along the ways we had partners within the clinical system and partners within the payer system that we gathered and that helped us instrumentally in figuring that out. And over time now, we have figured out really rigorous and refined processes on how to do that, as how to work with our industry partner, how upfront to talk to them about how we engage partners at the clinical system, how we engage right away with folks at the payer, and how we do that to make sure that as we get to the finish line, that we have the successful results and the evidence that is going to resonate with kind of all of our stakeholders.
Yeah, thank you, Eileen. I understand you had to be somewhat creative, working out a way to reimburse your providers for this care that they were making available in the pilot process. And I appreciate it's likely not scalable or generalizable for every example like this, but I think it's an interesting story. Can you take a moment to share that?
That's a great question, Joe Carroll. Yes, we were able to, within medical policy, understand how to adapt a current existing medical policy to account for the free Spira device and how it is able to treat our members. And after that, we were able to take a procedure code that is currently not otherwise classified. And then Deborah was able to become provider credentialed and then begin to negotiate with our provider contracting team a rate that was mutually acceptable based on that what we had learned through the economics of the quality improvement study.
That's great. So Deborah, anything you want to add in terms of the logistics of getting things launched? Any particular needs that you feel are critical in order to make it successful?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's really important is when you're a small company like ours and you're working with a large payer, that you really need to be mindful and be flexible with your approach to being paid, for example. So I went into the discussion thinking that we would be paid as a bundled program because Free Spirit is a device. We also have coaching. And so my assumption was that we would be paid as a case rate or bundled program. Yet what I heard from the contracting folks was, well, we can do that, but that'll take about 8 months or more because obviously there are a lot of people involved in the decision. But the contracting person said to me, if you want to become a credentialed provider and use the specific code, it's a HCPCS code. If you want to use that code that's not otherwise used for other products, we can get that done in a month. Like we could start generating revenue quickly. So of course I had to be and wanted to be flexible in order to be able to start generating revenue. So I think my point is that you should go in with maybe an idea in mind, but certainly be flexible about the way that you roll it out. It's the same about pricing. I mean, I definitely had a price in mind, and I was really happy with the discussion with Highmark because we made this a win-win. They were able to save significant dollars. We were able to come in at a price that we thought, was reasonable. So I also think that was really important. I mean, just in terms of the overall program, like Eileen said, we had a lot of learnings. We were the first company, and we collaborated and learned together, which was an important relationship for us. In the beginning, we hadn't thought about, or we weren't able to communicate with marketing because we didn't know if we were going to be successful in the QIP. It took us some time after the QIP was over and once we were looking at medical policy to connect with marketing and then create the marketing plans that we co-created in order to market to the Highmark members about FreeSpira. So I'd say, I think that that's been, at this point, it's smoother with the Vital program since then. But I think just thinking about how are you going to work with marketing and how are you going to co-create materials will be, that's important for any company going through the Vital program. I'd also say that, we had some issues with recruitment, which I think is also probably better because of the learning since then. One of the things about Highmark is that they own the Allegheny Health Network, but not all Allegheny Health Network members are Highmark members, and not all Highmark members go to Allegheny Health Network. So we made some assumptions early on of a larger patient population, but 50% of the people that called actually didn't have Highmark insurance. So, there were these types of learnings that I think maybe companies can understand as they start going into pilots like this pilot. But overall, I can say that this was such a successful program. It's really helped our company grow because a health economic study from such a large payer and an important payer like Highmark Health has helped us with other payers and other health plans that we've been able to bring on board since the Vital program.
Yeah, that's a terrific story. And I think there probably are some key insights from your expansion with other health plans and the VA that would be of interest to this audience. You want to share some of those, Deborah?
I would say that the VA is really very different, right? It's they have different mechanisms to be able to bring products in. For FreeSpira, we're on the federal supply schedule, but with the VA, it's more about calling on the clinicians, about, face-to-face. I would say for other health plans that we're working with, it's, we have a bit of a different business model, and that we're able to connect directly with their members, and then authorize, coach, and work with their members in order to treat them with FreeSpira. So, it's more of what we'll call a vertical model that we offer to health plans, bit different, like I said, from the VA. I can, you asked me the question about health plans and, what are the challenges in getting into health plans? Every health plan is different. So very often our clinical evidence is fine. We can get through the clinical part because we have so many clinical trials and they're very strong. Also the health economic study, but sometimes it's about the ROI. So some payers, want to look at a specific return on investment that the company needs to prove. Other times the health plans are fine with it, but they get stuck because we don't have a unique CPT or HCPCS code that allows them to fully integrate FreeSpira into their health plan. So I would say that that the work we've done with Highmark and all of our other clinical trials to date has really served us well. And we need to work with payers and determine what is important to them. Is it more the clinical? Is it more on the ROI? And then we need to work with them in order to get FreeSpira into their health plan to treat their patients, because as you can tell, we have very successful results, not only in panic, but our PTSD results are quite compelling.
That's great. Thank you. One more question for you, and then we'll go back to Vital. Certainly your platform, you're able to track compliance and number of times that the treated patient is using the system. Are there other data elements that you are able to access from your platform?
Right. So we have a clinical assessment there's a different assessment for patients that have PTSD versus patients that have panic or panic disorder. So for individuals that are determined eligible for FreeSpira, that have panic disorder or panic attacks, we have a PDSS, so the Panic Disorder Severity Scale. It's a standard scale that's used by psychologists for this condition. And it's available. We not only have a baseline, but we also have a weekly assessment that the patient will do on our tablet. That information is securely transmitted to the cloud for the providers, for the health plans, for our coaches. So we can actually track the patient's clinical improvement over the 1 month period with the PDSS. For the PTSD patients, we have a PCL5. It's a different scale, but similar concept that we can track improvement or progress from the first week to the 4th week of treatment. And remember, it's a 4-week treatment, after which the device is returned to the company.
Great, thank you. So Eileen, I suspect that there are those in our audience who are very interested in finding out if their technologies may become part of your program. And I also am aware that Highmark has a coverage with evidence development policy in addition. Can you start by explaining the difference between the VITAL program and the CED that Highmark, I believe, had prior to VITAL, and then what criteria would make a technology of consideration for the VITAL program, and how do you choose?
Sure. No, absolutely. Good questions, both. So the VITAL program is seen, we almost have developed a continuum of how we develop evidence or think about it at Highmark Health. The coverage with evidence determination program that the health plan has rolled out was actually done just last year. And it was done with VITAL in mind. We actually collaborate, and you can apply for either VITAL or the coverage with evidence determination, or both. So we do medical economic analysis for the coverage with evidence determination program. So we can submit on behalf of the technology company into the health plan's coverage with evidence determination, or the company can submit directly to the health plan with existing portfolio of evidence if they believe they already have kind of that necessary portfolio. They can submit directly in. The reason that there is some difference there is the coverage with evidence determination and can give you the ability to get funding directly from the health plan if they approve it through the committee, and you can run it at multiple sites. And sometimes why we run it in parallel is we might do the study, as Deborah mentioned, at Allegheny Health Network, and we might then branch out and run it at one of our strategic partner sites at Penn State Health Medical, Hershey Medical Center, or Christiana Care, which are other Highmark Health provider sites. So we will do the study test design the same, but the studies in parallel, so that we're developing kind of a wealth of information, and that we have that to submit not only the VITAL evidence, but we've also generated additional coverage of evidence determination. So it's a way to, in parallel, kind of develop multiple real world evidence that the company and the physician is able to use. So coverage with evidence development is submitted by either VITAL or the clinician, and VITAL, the clinician or the company can submit to. So there's a little bit of the difference.
So if a company would like to approach you, do they
Yes.
need to find a clinical champion first, or can you help with that?
Great question, great question. So we absolutely have to have a clinical champion, but we can help with that. So it would be great if you've already had some conversations and do have someone in mind, but you can still come directly to us. And we do have a website, www.vitalinnovation.com, and there is a get in touch form, and it's very easy. It comes to our email address, or you can be provided with my email address, Joe Carroll, afterwards. I can take that information directly, and we can, discuss your solution. And some of the requirements are whether or not you have the required approvals and have done kind of the clinical validation of your tool. And then we start to talk about like the prior clinical literature, and if it's been validated, we then get a clinical opinion. We have specialists identified within our clinical network that will take a look at it, and we'll have an initial discussion. And if that there is interest within our network, we then start to look at our data. and do that assessment that, Deborah had referenced about whether or not this would be an opportunity and we have the population that would warrant running a prospective test on.
That's terrific. Well, I so appreciate both of you joining us today. It was a fantastic discussion with you, and I know you'll have a lot of interest following this. So we're now going to transition to our panel with several speakers to respond to questions, which hopefully people have been able to submit. And again, Deborah, Eileen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe Carroll.
Thank you.
For your questions.
Thank you, everybody. That was absolutely fantastic, and really pleased with how things have gone so far. Want to let everybody know a couple of housekeeping things. We will be posting the slides in the video, as well as we're developing an executive summary document, which will be shared with everyone when it's available. We really want to thank all of our participants today. Let me introduce my co-moderator for the panel that we are starting now. Kimberly Sterling is with ResMed and is the Health Economics and Outcomes Research Lead at ResMed, and chairs our Real World Evidence Work Group and was really a crucial guide for developing the content of today's program. So Kimberly, welcome. We also have several of our program participants who've been able to stay with us today. Phil Adamson is here from Abbott, and Emily Zeitler from Dartmouth, and Steve Farmer from CMS. And we have two additional participants. The representative from Freespira is now Dr. Bob Kyler, who is happy to fill in and answer any questions that may arise. And Charlie Viviano from FDA is also with us to respond to any questions around FDA's guidance on real world evidence and other information. We were not able to have Eileen Rogers from the Vital Innovation Program with us, but we do have a question from the audience that would have gone to Eileen. Can we post that? Sorry, I blanked on the name of who asked it. Betsy. Betsy Gross asked, are there particular disease states that Highmark has indicated are areas of interest for them and for technology evaluation to improve outcomes and cost? And Eileen is not here currently to answer that directly. And she was very sorry to have to miss this part of the program. She did offer her email address because we had guessed that there would be interest from particularly the industry participants in today's program in exploring an opportunity to work with the Vital Innovations Program and Highmark to perhaps study their technologies. So the email address should be posted in the chat for you, or if for some reason that gets lost, please let us know. We're happy to provide that. So let me now go to Steve and Emily. You had both covered some very interesting elements on coverage with evidence development. And Steve, do you have further comments, having heard Emily's presentation, and any additional information you would like to share at this point?
Analysis of our CED policies since 2006 and has gathered some really important insights that I think really resonate with me. The first thing I would want to note, though, in thinking about CED is that CED expands coverage for our beneficiaries, and it is used in circumstances where the existing evidence is insufficient to reach an R&N decision. So it offers an opportunity for those technologies that are emerging where there's a lot of promise, but still open questions which are important to our beneficiaries. So that's a critical point to make. It's not just an imposition of burden on the public, but rather expands access. So, but to speak to the points that she raised, I think that I agree with her that it's important to have an accountable stakeholder that is going to help to steward that evidence development. And absent that, it can be uncertain the timing with which evidence will be generated and the nature of any evidence that will be generated. I think that we have learned that stakeholder burden is really important, and I was delighted when in the context of the most recent TEER decision, transcatheter edge-to-edge repair decision, the Heart Valve Collaboratory was able to work on the case report form for both TAVR and also TEER to substantially reduce the number of fields to the minimum necessary to actually address the most important and essential questions in that registry, which substantially improved the process or the burden for those stakeholders. I think that I'm hopeful that the approach that we're taking really is responsive to the full spectrum of issues that she raised. So I'm really keen to hear how she reacted to my presentation.
All right, Emily, we told him to be nice. So you get a chance to respond. And as you think about what to share at this point, we're also curious whether you have come across any devices that had to leave the commercial market due to what were perceived as CED related barriers.
Well, thank you for, number one, the opportunity just to talk about this policy that I've just been kind of obsessed with for a long time, and the opportunity to talk with Dr. Farmer about it. He's, I just have to say, he's an incredible advocate for evidence and in that way for Medicare beneficiaries. So I think we're lucky that he's around. You know, I think the recommendations made both in my presentation today and in the analysis on which those were based come as no surprise to anybody who's paying attention to this policy, to the CED policy. And you know, I sincerely meant that the lessons learned do appear to be pretty carefully integrated into policies that are being developed now, specifically TSET that Dr. Farmer talked about. And I'm just absolutely delighted to see that those lessons appear to have been taken to heart. And you know, I appreciate the point that Dr. Farmer brought up regarding how stakeholder involvement in, well, as an example, in the TEER decision led to a simplification of the data collection form. You know, one thing that gets brought up all the time in the context of registry-based data collection is, you know, want to know versus need to know. And when you're developing a registry data collection form, especially when you're sitting around a boardroom perhaps and not outside the control room after having done a long procedure, it's easy to add things to that data collection form because it would be nice to know. It would be nice to answer a million questions, but what do we really need to know? And I think the evolution of the TEER CED is a great reflection or a great example of recognition of that. And you know, if that lesson is truly taken to heart as TSET evolves, I think we will be in a good spot because we should be focusing on what we really need to know, what questions really need to be answered, which brings us back to what I think is one of the most important aspects of, again, I use the word with some hesitation, but for successful CED, knowing what the questions are is critically important. And you know, what we think the questions are at the beginning, those might evolve. And so being open to an evolution of what the questions are, just as in the case of TAVR, where, you know, the questions about the highest risk patients were not the same questions as those related to the lowest risk patients. So being open to that evolution is a really nice thing to see. In regards to the second part of your question, Joe Carroll, I think our audience might be in a better position to answer it. I'm not aware of any devices or therapies or services which either never made it to market or were completely eliminated from the market based on CED requirements specifically. Certainly, there are examples to the contrary. There are examples of devices that may not have made it to the market without CED. Just as Dr. Farmer mentioned, that CED really is at its core an expansion of access for Medicare beneficiaries. So, for example, the Watchman left atrial appendage occlusion device initially did not meet its primary endpoint through its pre-market trial, and perhaps Dr. Viviana could speak to that. But there was a lot of re-examination of the data and re-study to try and identify what the benefits and risks were of that device in the pre-market space. And without a way to cover that device through the CED, it may not have made it to the market. So I don't know if my other panelists know of examples, of the opposite, or if our audience does, but I'm not aware of any.
Great. Thank you, Emily. Kimberly, you want to?
Great. Follow-up question from Naomi Aronson just came in related to CED. So I think before we leave this topic, it's directed to you, Dr. Zeitler, but also Dr. Farmer, if you want to comment. The question is, the duration of CED often seem long in relation to what would be required to observe the outcome. Do you know what the issues were?
I imagine that Dr. Farmer will have comments as well, but based on my review of the program, the formal trigger for a reexamination can come from any source. So any member of the public or regulator or industry or any stakeholder can trigger a reexamination of a CED. So if it didn't happen, then I guess we can assume that no one asked, or no one asked formally, perhaps. We mentioned the TAVR example, which has been going on for some time, but there have been reexaminations. I think the more frustrating examples are those that went on for a really long time without reexamination. The ICD for primary prevention, CED, went on for 12 years, when I think you could reasonably argue that the questions posed in the CED in 2005 were pretty well answered before those 12 years were up. So I'm curious what Dr. Farmer would say, but my understanding is that really the trigger is any formal request from anyone.
Well, I think it's important to note here that while the topics that are addressed through coverage with evidence development are innovations and are testing out a new approach to a therapy or addressing a new disease state, the policy itself was an innovation and was subject to learning as we tried it out in different use cases, as we experienced different contexts with different types of devices and different stakeholders and different types of questions that were unaddressed at the time of entry into the market. As Dr. Zeitler pointed out, oxygen for cluster headache is an example where there wasn't a clear stakeholder that would be responsible for initiating a study. And so even though a study could have been potentially initiated to address the questions raised in the decision over a shorter time frame, if nobody initiates the study, then the study hasn't been completed, and then you can't close the question. One change in a potential TCET pathway would be to, in the context of a device where the manufacturer engages with CMS in the pre-market phase, if they propose a specific evidence development plan, we would have a time frame over which we would know that it might be appropriate to examine the literature and to have a reasonable expectation there would be material changes to that evidence base that might warrant a change in the policy. So I think that is a major shift in how we could approach this issue that would help to address the problem.
So let me ask Dr. Kyler, there were a couple of comments or questions that came in when your colleague spoke about the FreeSpira example. So let's start with the first one from Sanjoy Roy. Are the impressive FreeSpira results published? We can start with an easy one there.
Sure. Yeah, there have been multiple publications in peer-reviewed journals. There are studies for panic disorder done at multiple anxiety treatment centers around the country. Another was a collaborative with Comcast and Crossover Clinic that looked at application in an employment setting. Another that Eileen and Deborah talked about was the collaboration with Highmark Health and AHN that looked at clinical as well as economic outcomes. A study published out of the Palo Alto VA for treatment of PTSD. And we have a paper under review right now, which is a report of about 1,600 patients, real world evidence with pre-treatment and post-treatment symptom reduction available.
Great. So let's go to another audience question, and we definitely are enjoying having a choice of questions from the audience and then some of the prepared ones. Naomi Aronson asks a question that I think is definitely important for the work that you've done, but also relates to other work that is done with RWE. And she asks, please describe how change in emergency department visits with FreeSpira were measured. And I think in particular that I'm very interested in your response is any complexities in measuring the changes in ER.
Yeah, the only formal study that has looked at that is in the Highmark collaboration, and that was really at a pretty non-specific level. That project looked at total ED costs in the 1 year prior to treatment and the 1 year post-treatment. There's a subsequent data analytic project going on with Highmark now that is going to look more granular at, for example, differentiating behavioral from medical ED visits and both frequency and cost. Also, in some of our work on data analytics, this is not part of a published study, but collaboration with customers where we've looked at claims data, we've really worked at differentiating. So, for example, that we would not count, for example, a pregnancy-related or a motor vehicle accident-related ED as relevant to the condition, but someone who, for example, had kind of a non-specific anxiety diagnosis, but left with a diagnosis of tachycardia or non-cardiac chest pain. Those are the kind of visits that are really kind of closely related to the conditions that we treat. And subsequently, those are the kind of metrics that we'll really kind of focus on.
Excellent. So how about we shift back to Joe Carroll?
Sure. So thank you very much. Oops, I think we lost one of them. We have two questions from Sandy Ruggles. And Sandy, thanks for joining us today. The first one is coverage by class. Steve, you mentioned that in your comments rather than device by device, specifically manufacturer by manufacturer. I know that the TSET is still very much in development, and I suspect that anything you can say will be really your own thoughts about this rather than any finalized CMS position. But how would you think about class?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and what I would offer there is a pair of examples. So there are several transcatheter aortic valves that are used in TAVR, which are used for in the same position with a similar function with design differences perhaps, but that are substitutes for one another with the same indication effectively. That's very different from the transcatheter mitral valve repair decision for at the other extreme. So for transcatheter mitral valve repair, when we initially wrote that decision, there was only one device in the market, which was MitraClip, and so you could use that imprecision in language of a transcatheter mitral valve repair. But at the time when we reconsidered the decision to expand coverage to functional mitral regurgitation, there were other devices in development that addressed the transcatheter annuloplasty, chordal repair, all of which were transcatheter mitral valve interventions, but were so distinct from an edge-to-edge repair technique that is approximated with a MitraClip-like device, that the evidence base wouldn't necessarily extend to those other devices. And so that's the distinction that we're making. Does the device have similar, are there similar devices with a similar indication that could be grouped together, where evidence development for one could apply to the others, or are they so distinct that they need to be considered independently? And policy can at times be an art, and I can't speak to every possible iteration of this circumstance, but I think that illustrates the principle, at least at a high level.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Before I go to the next question from Sandra Ruggles, let me just ask you, Steve, one of the requests in the listening sessions that were conducted by CMS, and as well as comments you made, had to do with early engagement with CMS to talk about how to design and plan for any real world evidence and enhancements to the available evidence. Knowing that CMS has fairly limited resources, what would you recommend to our industry representatives in this audience about when and how to approach CMS for that initial conversation? I know that you would like to be open to everybody that knocks on the door, but it would be difficult.
And that's absolutely true. While CMS has been very open to engaging with industry partners or other stakeholders along the way to address issues around emerging technologies or new technologies or even existing ones, there are limits to what we can offer, and we don't have a huge team that can look at all the technical details of clinical studies in advance. One area that, as I mentioned, we're considering is considering therapeutic areas, outcomes of interest, durations of follow-up, specific instruments within buckets or categories for specific conditions like patient-reported outcomes for heart failure. What might those be that CMS would find compelling? What is a clinically meaningful difference? How long do those need to be followed for? With that information, I would hope that manufacturers could incorporate those into pivotal clinical studies in a way that they could meet both the immediate needs of FDA market authorization, but also establish the foundations for longer-term follow-up with clinical outcomes that would be compelling to CMS as well, and kill two birds with one stone, as it were. I mean, one challenge with real-world evidence, particularly for interventions where there's lots of nuance, or where severity of disease is not ascertainable from administrative claims or consistently captured in electronic medical records, is how do you construct a comparable control such that you can establish the effectiveness of a therapy in a new group of patients and over a longer time horizon. I think that conceiving of these issues up front would allow you potentially to extend your pre-market study into the post-market phase so that you can leverage the randomization that you achieved up front with longer-term follow-up using real-world outcomes in a way that would be more compelling than you can achieve merely by real-world evidence alone. And that's not to say that you might not want to supplement that with other approaches like propensity score matching or other approaches like that. But that one challenge that I've seen is how do you construct a credible control group, and that's one potential solution that's worthy of consideration.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And that actually fits very nicely with another question from Sandy Ruggles that is directed to Emily Zeitler. And there it is, for those that can't read that tiny print. What about the circumstance where there's a very small number of patients, and that was the issue with the heart pump registry, and this is really for Steve as well, during the CED program. Many of the most innovative technologies that are hoping to get approved and on the market may address a very small patient population and require extended data collection in order to identify the actual benefits and challenges with a very high burden to the developer. Can the two of you respond to that question? Are there elements that you learned in your review, Emily, that you think could have changed the outcome with the artificial heart registry? And Steve, your thoughts when really you're dealing with a small population, many of whom are Medicare beneficiaries for whatever reasons, their disability or their age, but difficult to really have clear direction.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, I'm of course curious what Dr. Farmer will say, and perhaps even some of the clinical trialists we have here. I don't know what Dr. Adamson might have some thoughts as well. But, when I think about the artificial heart example, my takeaway was that, it might have been knowable at the time that was considered that it would be a very small population, perhaps not. But if it were known, maybe the CED mechanism would have not been the right choice, knowing, obviously hindsight's 2020 here. We can look back and say there weren't enough patients really to make a sweeping national coverage decision based on those, that small group. So I think my assessment would be that the CED is probably not the right mechanism in order to get the data needed to make that determination. And perhaps in the case of artificial hearts, that continuing to provide that service or that therapy at the local level would have offered the opportunity to collect real world data, essentially in the same way. There still could be a registry to collect those data, and then coverage could be reconsidered any time thereafter, and you would still provide access to patients, and to use CMS's terminology in a more flexible way on a patient by patient basis. So I actually think that in that specific example, that it got to where it needed to go. It just took a long time, and maybe if those things had been recognized earlier on, it might have gotten there sooner, and it would have been better alignment between giving Medicare beneficiaries access to this really niche therapy, aligning that access with really the data, the evidence that was known at the time, and the mechanisms available to gather more data.
Yeah. So, Steve, I'm going to digress for a moment here and ask Charlie, from FDA's perspective, and I suspect you weren't involved in the review and approval of this particular technology, but can you comment about how FDA looks at the technologies where the populations that could be treated are really quite small and difficult to build the kinds of trials that FDA, as well as everybody else, would like to see in terms of the representation, the number of participants, the ability to randomize, all the things we've heard, but that's not always a possibility. How does FDA approach it?
Yeah, thanks, Joe Carroll. I think it's challenging, right? In those disease states where the patient populations are small, it's very challenging to recruit, to maintain follow-up in those patients. We try to be flexible, understanding, the lay of the land, so to speak. We have various different pathways to market or to get devices on the market, human device exemptions, et cetera, where the statutory authority is a little bit different than it would be, for example, for a PMA or pre-market authorization. But we just try to be iterative and interactive with sponsors in those device spaces. And it can be challenging to spur interest and innovation in those very challenging areas. But I wish I had a magic wand that would make recruiting and study design answers to overcome those challenges. But it really just boils down to our review teams trying to be flexible. And the FDA is well suited to having those early discussions that Dr. Farmer mentioned earlier, to try to get some agreement on those study designs and get them fit for purpose. So we have those pre-submissions where stakeholders can come to the FDA early on in the process, identify the challenges associated with device innovation and marketing in clinical trials and data collection in general, including real-world data, real-world evidence generation in those populations. And it's a matter of just being iterative and understanding what the background is.
Great, thank you. Kimberly?
Great. So when Dr. Atkinson and I first met, he described himself as a clinical trialist, which my ears perked up given his opening comments, which were fantastic. I'd love to hear from you some of your comments on where RWE fits within clinical trial evidence. And then Dr. Kyler, just to let you know, I'll be asking a follow-up question, so be prepared for that.
Thank you, Kimberly. I appreciate very much being involved in this symposium. Real-world evidence, I think, has a very unique position in the ongoing evidence base. And I think the stability of evidence over time, the congruence of results with different data sets that are used to generate real-world evidence, create an evidence base that can be supportive of use of a device, for example, in a chronic disease. Depends, of course, on the database, the robustness of the methodology, and the comparators. And I will mention that the concept of a concomitant control in, say, for example, a claims database is a very intriguing way to and methodology to really ask a question that's close to randomization. Certainly, we have had experience with propensity matching, but also adding to that disease matching. So, for example, in people with heart failure, matching the number of hospitalizations they had prior to the index moment in which they're involved in the trial, and the length of stay and the time elements of disease, as much as can be rendered by the claims databases, can provide a very robust way to have a concomitant control process. Not perfect, but it is certainly supportive of the outcomes that are seen in pivotal clinical trials. So I believe that it is a component of the totality of the evidence. It should be considered valuable. Robust measurements of effectiveness in the real world, I think, are ones that can supplement what we learn from prospective clinical trials.
Excellent. And I'm wondering, Dr. Kyler, if you can talk about any examples that FreeSpira may have to share on how RWE can be used to really understand the generalizability of data that's been generated in RCTs.
Terrific. So I mentioned earlier, a number of published clinical trials. One thing that stands out about those trials is that the pattern of recovery and adherence is really remarkably comparable from independent trial to independent trial. But really kind of baked into the architecture of our system is data analytics and data capture that measures session completion, adherence, physiologic factors, reported symptom reduction, actually during the course. So it's not retrospectively collected. So accumulating the evidence patient by patient has really been very important for us to really kind of go beyond the formal clinical trial and to look at, in real world clinical settings, are we treating the same kinds of patients? I mentioned before, we're hopefully to publish soon a series of about 1,600 patients. And what we've found is that the level of severity of panic symptoms and PTSD symptoms are very comparable to what was, there in the formal clinical trials. Adherence, dropout rates are all very comparable to the trials. So it's important to us internally so that we kind of are able to do really just kind of that internal audit that we are continuing to treat the patients that we're cleared for. But then from a larger standpoint, that kind of data transparency with customers or potential customers is really important to establish that we really kind of aim to treat specific populations and that we will be collecting and reporting with transparency which members opt for the treatment, what their adherence and dropout is like, whether they're symptom reductions or robust. And that kind of transparency, I think, is really kind of critically important to layer that real world approach on top of the published clinical trials.
Great. Thank you, Bob. So next we have a question from Steve Phillips, which great question. Thanking Steve Farmer for his presentation about CMS's current thinking about improving access to innovative new technologies. Recognizing this is all prior to any formal proposal, Steve, can you give some sense of your thinking about the general timeframes for establishing CED under TSET following FDA approval for a new technology? I think there's an assumption built in here that I'm not sure CMS is necessarily intending that there would be a formal CED for everything that is in the scope of whatever is written into the TSET proposal when it is available. But Steve, let me let you address this.
Well, thank you. And as Joe Carroll mentioned, this is a pathway that we're exploring. We're exploring different elements. We're actively engaging with the public on different facets of it. But there are some aspects of it that are true no matter how we design it. And if it follows our existing laws, it has to have an open and transparent public element to it, which means that it cannot be instantaneous. Because you cannot just post a decision on day one of the FDA market authorization that hasn't gone through a public process and have it be consistent with the Administrative Procedures Act. So that's point number one. The second point is from comments and feedback that we got on MCIT, the challenges were not solely that there was a desire for day one access or market access to different devices, but rather that there's greater transparency and certainty about the process by which new technologies would be reviewed. And that certainly we can do. So I can't tell you exactly how long a coverage review would require after FDA market authorization, but I can say that given that it has to align lots of different moving pieces, each of which is independent and many of which are out of our control, it would not be likely that you're going to get instantaneous coverage at a national level for an emerging technology. It just it would be contrary to the existing laws. They would have to change for us to do that. I can't tell you exactly how long it would take. I can tell you that it won't be instant, but we can do our best to make it transparent and efficient.
Thanks, Steve. There's a question from Henry Alder that I'm going to ask you to comment on as well, Steve. other than cardiac devices and procedures, what other device categories are appropriate for RWE that payers will find useful in making coverage decisions. And Steve, I'll let you comment if there's anything you want to add to your the comments you've already made, and then I will be happy to step in for a moment from my former life with Kaiser Permanente, just to add a slightly different payer perspective, since we don't have anyone else.
Well, so, when you think about devices, there's a tremendous range of devices out there. Cardiac devices are one, and I think there's been a presumption because many prior CEDs have addressed cardiac implanted devices that that is the paradigm that could apply to anything coming through a TSET pathway. But in fact, the FDA definition of a device is much broader. It could include diagnostic lab tests. It could include durable medical equipment. Certainly, while there are the number of coverage relevant devices coming through the pathway is clustered often in the cardiac space, there are the full spectrum of medical conditions could be covered through this pathway. So I don't think that this would be exclusive to cardiac devices. So my second comment about it would be that real world evidence could be applied to almost any topic, provided that there is sufficient specificity in patient identification in both treatment and control arm in propensity score matching, or that you can identify a patient cohort clearly in the data, and that you have relevant outcomes of interest and covariates that you can capture from the data. The third point would be that the nature of the questions you're asking could differ very much depending on the topic. So if it's an implanted cardiovascular device, it may be more about durability of the intervention and generalizability to the Medicare population that typically is more complex, older, more frail than is included in clinical trials. But for a diagnostic lab test, it might be more along the lines of clinical utility, demonstrating that a diagnostic lab test is actually beneficial to beneficiaries. Information isn't necessarily beneficial if you don't have a use for it. So I'm not saying that that we would cover that full spectrum of devices in a pathway, but I'm just merely trying to illustrate that the types of questions and the way that you might need to use data might differ very much between different types of devices.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Just very quickly, recognizing that Kaiser Permanente is not a typical example of a non-CMS plan, and coverage isn't really the terminology that's used. Just my own comment here is that in many situations involving devices where there are clinicians who are really a significant variable in what the ultimate outcomes may well be, the skills of the cardiologist or surgeon or whomever can significantly change things. I think there are a number of categories where real-world evidence has, in fact, more relevance in some decisions about the appropriate adoption and management of new technologies. So I would just put that comment in there. I know we're getting close to the end of our session here today, and I again want to thank all of our participants. Everybody was fantastic. Really appreciate your engagement. We do have a question that was raised earlier about from Lauren Baskin that regarding the slides from Dr. Goodman, and this is true for the other slides that were shared today. We do plan to post those. We'll also mention that the work that Cliff and the Lewin group did has been written up and submitted to Value in Health for hopefully publication, which is why some of the material that we're able to distribute with everybody right now is a bit limited as we need a decision on the publication one way or another, either as published in a peer-reviewed journal such as Value in Health, or as a white paper from MDIC. It will be made available to all of you. And as well, we will be sharing the entire video program and other slides with you. And as I said earlier, the executive summary will be available. So again, we really appreciate it. Let me just check with my colleagues. Do we have anyone who would like to make any final comments before we close out our session? Did I miss a question from the audience? No, I think we've got them. Wonderful. Well, again, thank you, everybody. And we look forward to another event where we can share our thoughts. We do have the MDIC Annual Public Forum the week after Labor Day week. It will be presumably live in Washington, D.C. area. I think I will finally get to meet some of my colleagues at the organization, and I never saw the existing offices where they're moving to a new location. So I'll see the new office then, and hope to meet many of you at that event. It will be September 12th will be a segment on addressing inequities and need for inclusion in various decisions around technology coverage. And we are putting together what I think will be a terrific program for that with payers, NIH, and others. And in the afternoon of that Monday will be a patient session, a patient engagement, and then the usual MDIC Annual Public Forum on Tuesday, February 13th, and hope you all can make it. Thank you very much.